Uh, Thanks very much, Gautam. Um, I'm actually not very happy with the title. I chose the title under duress. I got this email saying, look, please send me a title, send me a title. So I sent Aruna the title that just came to mind because I didn't want to make it late and I should have called it something else. But first of all, it's a great honor to speak at ICTS at 10. I've been interacting in various ways with ICTS since quite early. I've really admired the very broad and open view that ICTS has taken of science, of theoretical science, always with a view to including many areas that are quite different from those that the founders of ICTS were really into. So it's been something we've really liked. There's a school on mechanics and biology and so forth that we ran a long time ago, which was through the generosity of ICTS. So it's been a brilliant 10 years. Congratulations to all of you, to Spenta, to Rajesh, and to everybody. And it's a treat. I take every chance I can to come here. If there's talks here, I grab the shuttle and come all the way out here to listen to them. It's a wonderful institution. Okay, that's where I am. I still retain an adjunct affiliation with TIFR, for which I'm also very grateful. And I just thought, especially since I'm not going to be talking about most of my students' work, I just tell you that this is my group. I'll talk about the work of some of them. I won't talk about the work of some others. Not everything I do is in active matter, but that's them. Okay, so what I'm really going to talk about is active matter. I'd actually planned this talk on the assumption that there's lots of folks in the audience who haven't heard me talk before. I'm not so sure that's the case. So I apologize to those who heard me talk on this topic, because I am going to give a brief review right at the beginning of relatively early results before going on further. So I'll introduce the topic and tell you some background and so forth. Then what I'll do, with apologies actually, because I've been hearing people say the talk was too technical and so forth. So this talk is going to have a technical core, in part because of the very intimidating invitation from Rajesh, who said, which I took to mean, keep it somewhat high theory. Luckily, though, I don't really do higher mathematics. I do what you might, the mathematics I use in any high school in India would be called lower mathematics. In any case, I'll tell you about how you describe these systems that you call active matter, and I'll talk also about building specific active system models, some experiments, and then I'll talk about something that takes off from here, and I'll summarize. Active matter as a subject has sort of really taken off in recent years to the extent that there's perhaps an overabundance of review articles on it. I've just listed some of the ones. That top one not really being a review, but a kind of stock taking of the subject. Okay, so this is bad. This movie was playing earlier and won't play now. That's incredible. That is my only really animal movie. Rats. It's life. Okay. That's actually a flock of millipedes, which was playing till half an hour ago. Just stop now. All right. So, active systems is a term used to describe collections of living organisms or their energy-consuming, energy-dissipating, and moving constituents. So basically, if you think of a collection of particles, each of which at the level of that constituent has a dissipative arrow of time. So each component of the system steadily transduces free energy and turns it into some kind of movement. In other words, that detail balance or dissipative time reversal is broken at the scale of each of the constituents of that system. And if you have a collection of such systems, you call a system like that active matter. And you can, of course, this is really annoying. You can, of course, use these ideas to try to describe collections of living organisms or collections of the kind of thing that Joe Howard will talk about in his talk on motors. But you can also think about ways you could create artificial objects which answer to this requirement. So you could imagine doing it chemically by having a particle which in some way catalyzes a chemical in its surroundings and sets up flows and swims. Or you could have an object that's just mechanically agitated and which by virtue of the asymmetry of its shape turns into an object that is in effect self-propelled, converting the energy that you're putting in by shaking the system into some kind of movement. More exotically, essentially any system which you can homogeneously suffuse with a flux of energy, which by virtue of some structures in the system, it can take up and use and turn into some kind of directed motion. Even a two-leg agitated with microwaves, in many ways is like an active system. I will not have time to talk about this, but I just thought I'd mention it to provoke the audience. Okay. So I'll first give you a bit of history, a bit of what we did in the past, and something about the issues involved. So really, many years after we started working on this class of problems, I happened upon a paper while I was looking for something else, which back in the late 60s already discussed the idea of, in a fluid mechanical context, saying, suppose you have a chunk of stuff inside which something is happening, and as a result of which you end up getting spontaneous motions in the interior of the medium without external forces. They said that this would be clearly this kind of thing happens in living matter, and you should view it as a kind of soft matter or complex fluid system. This is virgin territory for research in complex fluids. These ideas are destined to play a large part in understanding living systems. So these guys really had a very, very large number of these ideas a long time ago because they were trying to understand some sort of oscillatory behavior in some cellular aggregates from an organism whose name I've forgotten. Interestingly, they considered what in the current terminology of the field might be called scalar active matter. That is, the materials they looked at didn't have any anisotropic structure. I mean, the models they looked at didn't have any anisotropic structures inside them. They discussed systems in which any vectorial object in the medium, let us say stress tensors, was built by composition of gradients of various scalar quantities like concentration or temperature. The only independent vector field they had was a velocity field. And they make much of a point about this for some reason, which I didn't understand. In any case, that paper, even the term active stress, which many of us thought we had invented, turns out to already be there in these papers in the late 1960s. So much early research in the early 2000s and so forth looked at the statistical and fluid mechanics of active systems with an emphasis on ordered states and with an emphasis on saying, okay, you have a system like this, compare it to a system with the same spatial symmetry but equilibrium rather than active, and then discuss the ways in which these two systems are different. So, you basically, you have various rules that equilibrium systems obey, having to do with statistics of fluctuations, having to do with positivity of various quantities. You look at the way in which active systems depart from those rules. I mean, for example, you look at flocks and you look at them as an ordering of a velocity field. You look at a fluid membrane and look at the dynamics of the displacements and look at the statistics of that and see if it's stable, or see if it's singular in ways different from an equilibrium membrane. Or you consider a large collection of swimming objects moving through a fluid as a kind of liquid crystal, and then you look at the ways in which that liquid crystal violates the rules that you know to apply to equilibrium liquid crystals. And that was really what dominated the game for quite a long time. Current issues I'll come to. I will, again, I crave the indulgence of my old friends in the audience who've seen these bits before, just to tell you very quickly in about 3 or 4 slides what happened in this field from the early stages. Basically, among the early landmarks in this game was that we formulated the hydrodynamics of collections of self-propelled particles moving through a fluid and said if you have an ordered phase of these guys, it's like a liquid crystal, but a liquid crystal made of things that have a propulsion mechanism built into them. They disturb the fluid in certain characteristic ways, of which in a minimal sense there's only 2, either pulling or pushing, correspond to algae or bacteria. And among the very simple predictions that came out is that the presence of such objects in a fluid changes the mechanics of the fluid. If you have a bunch of these guys swimming around in the fluid, fluids containing these guys are more viscous when the algae are alive than when they are dead, and fluid containing these guys are less viscous when the bacteria are alive than when they're dead. people took these ideas seriously enough that they took organisms, the suspensions of such organisms, put them into rheometers and made measurements. And sure enough, so they're doing fluid mechanics of living stuff and answering, they were kind enough to do these measurements. And sure enough, that's exactly what they saw. And this subject, even though we started working on it quite a long time ago, is being pursued actually even as recently as a couple of years ago. And the results are quite dramatic. Okay. Another idea. So none of my movies, my God. Okay, we'll see. Ramesh, I'll find a way to make it work. Okay. This is rather frustrating. Well, it doesn't matter. Okay, so another result of the same active liquid crystal hydrodynamics was that globally aligned states of bulk active fluids are intrinsically unstable. So you can't have true liquid crystalline order in bulk three-dimensional active fluids, and this effect in which these structures go unstable and flow spontaneously was worked on by various groups, has been seen in as diverse settings as bacterial suspensions, suspensions of microtubules and motors with the necessary fuel, forming a self-stirring fluid, the interior of a living cell in which the fluid inside the cell and the filaments spontaneously set up flows which rotate the nucleus, the movie you can't see, censored presumably. And most recently, the same idea has been seen in a monolayer of cells, a dense monolayer of cells, where cells are elongated, and they form a kind of pneumatic liquid crystal. And if you watch this system on time scales of a day or two, you see the instability and you see the spontaneous flow at the rate of microns per day. So patient experiments, really patient experiments, show that the intrinsic instability of active, self-driven aligned filaments is actually seen over such a big range of scales. Okay. We also predicted that number fluctuations in these systems should be anomalously large. So in the pneumatic phase of a certain artificial system, which I'll come to, we predicted giant number fluctuations and a logarithmic decay of time correlations. And more important from the present context is that, and I don't know how to do this without going to the computer, topological defects, which in pneumatic liquid crystals can be of two kinds, like that, which is called strength minus half, or like that, which is called strength plus half, have interesting dynamical properties. The strength minus half guy, I don't know if you can see this very well, but is roughly threefold symmetric and doesn't have a sense of direction. The strength plus half guy has a nose. So in the driven state that we call an active liquid crystal, this vectorial character of this guy means that it should move. So it should be spontaneously motile. And this sequence of pictures shows that. That's a strength plus half, which over time moves from there to there, there, and there. And the minus half is basically sitting still. And so this is really old stuff, but I thought it was worth showing if it shows up on the screen at all. What's going on? Hello? Guys, I don't know. Well, this still should be enough. I'll just have to show you the movies later. It's all right. Okay. Carrying this idea further, and you remember I mentioned early in the talk that we would we created artificial realizations of these systems. Among the ideas we looked at was looking collections of mixtures of particles. And this again is a system driven by just vibrating a surface and particles lying on it. These things spontaneously form a flock whose movie I now fear is going to fail me. Let me see, maybe this one will work. This is incredible. That's a calamity. All right, no movies, guys. It's all. The rest of the talk can, yeah, we'll just live with it. So you get a spontaneous flock of these elongated, tapered particles. They turn and point all in the same direction and start going round and round. Should I try rebooting? It's not going to work, right? Yeah, all right. Let's see, yeah. Never happened before. Okay. So that was background, and I guess I've used up half my time on background and early results. But current issues in the field actually move a little bit away from these general questions rooted in globally aligned ordered states, flocking, and ideas like that, to say, okay, look, basically what you have when you have an active system is you've got a collection of particles, they're interacting. At the level of each particle, you've broken detail balance. What are the general laws governing a collection of particles if you don't have detail balance? And you're not driving the systems from a boundary or from an edge. At the level of every single component of the system, you don't have detail balance. What could the laws be? So, can you get vapor to liquid transitions, crystallization, liquid crystal formation, etc.? If so, what laws govern them? Can you somehow find the equivalent of a thermodynamics to understand what phase is selected, what phases can coexist, and so forth? And the rest of my talk, I'll say a little bit about two parts of this. Okay? All right. So now comes the fairly technical part of the talk. The idea is, when someone gives you a system that's out of equilibrium and say, okay, it's a non-equilibrium steady state, these are the variables, write down the dynamics by pure thought. What will you do? You will write down everything allowed by symmetry, means you'll look at the spatial symmetries of the system, and you'll write down everything allowed by conservation laws, and write general equations of motion, because you know how to do that. And then what you'll do is you'll make sure you don't make any assumption about time reversal invariance. You'll assume the time reversal invariance is something you don't have to worry about because these are driven systems. Thereby, typically what you'll get is you'll end up writing down terms that you could not have written down for the equilibrium system. And you can, of course, go with that. But supposing you wanted to understand it more systematically, then the way to look at it is to say, you've got some degrees of freedom, which I'm calling Q and P for a coordinate and a momentum that you're interested in. You've got some other variable, which ultimately will be the chemistry of the problem. You're driving that variable, and you want to build the equations of motion by writing down the general dynamics of all these guys. Initially, let's say you consider a system at thermal equilibrium with a coordinate Q, another coordinate X, and the corresponding momenta, and write down the Langevin equations for such a system. Okay? And the key part of those equations is to assume that some of the damping of the physical and the quote-unquote chemical components are coupled. So assume you've got an off-diagonal Onsager coefficient, which of course, since it's the dissipative coefficient, will be symmetric, and allow, because you're allowed to, allow that off-diagonal Onsager coefficient to depend on the coordinate. If you take this set of equations, and now let's forget about the momentum since we're talking about X should be viewed as the number of fuel molecules consumed. And what you want to know is, as that number of fuel molecules is eaten one by one by one, what dynamics do you get for your system? And so what you do is rewrite the whole dynamics, not in terms of the chemical variable, but in terms of the field driving the chemical variable, okay? And then hold that field constant. If you want to produce a driven state, just take those same equations that we're using for a thermal equilibrium system, now hold the driving force constant, and ask what you get. So what you will get will be the original dynamical equations you had for the coordinate and the momentum with modified damping, modified noise, and an extra term. So this general idea that you can throw in an extra term which you couldn't do before as long as you respect the spatial symmetries, hereby gets legalized by saying it actually came out of an analysis where you first wrote down the equilibrium dynamics and then held one driving force constant. The result then is a set of dynamical equations for the same variables as before. The chemical dynamics I've just hidden, and now you have terms here of a form that you couldn't have got in the equilibrium system. And except for a very special case where where let's say these variables are just a single scalar and you don't even have momentum, you just write down a positional dynamics. In general, the form of this term will be such that you won't be able to redefine the energy function, redefine the temperature, or anything to make it an effective equilibrium dynamics. So this is the general prescription for writing down these equations. Okay, and I have, okay. So this is the general prescription. You can actually take systems that you already know. Let's say you have imagine you have an interface with a lack of up-down symmetry and you hold it out of equilibrium. You should get the KPZ equation, right? This prescription will reproduce that, or it'll post facto justify that in a different way. Okay, so now can we take a couple of simple, well-known active particle models and see that they fit in this framework? So let's take one example. Suppose you've got a particle with a position q and carrying a little vector, capital Q, and write down the dynamics of this particle in a situation where this guy is self-driven in a direction dictated by Q. Okay, so imagine that Q dot little q travels in the direction dictated by big Q, either at a constant speed or at some speed which, at some velocity scale, but with the vector q itself kind of trying to relax to 0. You can imagine two different cases, right? One, we've got an object, you've got a dimer, and that dimer is fixed length, and it's only turning around, and it moves in the direction of the dimer. The other is you've got two particles connected by something, and their separation vector has a dynamics. So it has sort of a root mean square value, and it has some machinery that drives it to move in that direction. And there's an external potential. So the reason we're interested in this problem is it's tempting in a problem of this sort to think of the orientation variable as kind of a momentum. Okay? And you could ask, is there some limit in which this problem with a persistent self-propelling velocity and a position variable, and really no inertia intrinsically, acts just like an equilibrium system with some effective temperature and a kinetic and a potential energy. So this kind where the speed is fixed is called an active Brownian particle. This kind is called an active Ornstein-Uhlenbeck particle because this guy acts like a noise with a memory time tau, like an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process in stochastic processes. So you can do that, and the way to do it is to start with the coupled dynamics of a center of mass and a relative coordinate using the scheme that I described earlier. And if you do that, then the effective dynamics of the center of mass and relative coordinate acquires this so-called extra term not allowed at equilibrium. And if this term is odd, the detailed structure of this depends on the actual mechanics of the medium, but the off-diagonal coupling will in general give you a term which propels you in the direction dictated by this term. You can imagine the variable capital Q either just harmonically bound or bound in a potential that gives it a preferred length. This will amount to an active Brownian particle with essentially fixed speed. This will amount to an active Ornstein-Uhlenbeck particle. In both cases, what you will get is a dynamics that looks like particle moving at a certain velocity and that velocity responding to a force if you patch these things together. But you will always get a noise, a translational noise in the position equation in addition, which is to be kept in mind. So if you take these two together, if you throw away the noise provisionally, you can rewrite the coupled dynamics by writing q dot equals the rest of it, calling that a velocity, building the equation of motion for that velocity, and interestingly, this combination ends up looking precisely like a particle at thermal equilibrium in whatever potential this particle is in, with a mass given by the correlation time, the color of that colored noise. The only way, however, you can make that work is not to have these noises in the equation. The moment you have white noise in this equation, what happens then is that the entire process which you used in order to declare the right-hand side of this equation as a velocity fails because you can't differentiate these guys without running into further mathematical difficulty. These are already white noises. So if you switch off these noises, then for the specific case where the potential in which this center of mass is sitting is harmonic, you can turn the problem to an effective equilibrium problem. You can calculate entropy production, you'll find it's 0. And this is work that the Cambridge group did, ignoring these noises. But if we'll take a slightly more critical look at it, the presence of positional diffusion in that equation makes that, sort of vitiates that, if you like. Now you can take this problem and ask about entropy production. What do you mean by entropy production? What you do is you look at a forward process, say with probability P, and the reverse process with probability PR. You take the log of the ratio, divide by the time, take time going to infinity, and that's the rate of entropy production. The point, however, is that the value you get for this depends on how you define time reversal. So you can do this in two ways. You can treat capital Q like a velocity and say, what I want to know is how often do I see a particle going like this and taking certain steps and turning around and going backwards, the relative probability of those two. The other is a particle moving forward or moving backward without turning the velocity. And you get, so you can consider the probability of a sequence of positions with or without inverting the polarization, the orientation of the particle. And the result is that if you treat both variables as even under time reversal, you get one value of entropy production. If you treat the orientation as odd, you get a different value of entropy production. Both of these are in principle experimentally accessible comparisons that you can make. And the ratio of these two turns out to be the ratio of the memory time, of the relaxation time in the harmonic well in which the particle is, to the memory time of the noise. Only in the special limit where you switch off translational motion for the active particle do you end up getting that the entropy production is non-zero only if the potential has an anharmonic part. These two, even for just for a purely harmonic potential, are both non-zero. Neither of them corresponds to the value you get, namely 0, in the singular limit where you switch off translational diffusion. So this is among the issues we're currently working on. So now I will try, but if the movies are not going to work, I'm not sure what I can do with the talk. Just give me a minute. Will any of them work? This is incredible. Nope. Okay, we'll manage. So we were looking at experiments. We looked at this vibrated surface with particles on it, particles a few millimeters long and about a millimeter wide, shaken up and down, and the particles start walking. And we used them as a test active particle on which we did experiments, if you like, in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. Among the things that was measured was the large deviation function of the displacement along the direction which the particle is pointing. One of the things that those experiments turned up was that function looks like this. It has a slope discontinuity at the origin. As far as I know, this is the only experimental realization of this slope discontinuity, which actually turns out to have been predicted a few years earlier by Udo Seifert's group for a particle moving through a periodic medium. The large deviation function itself, I should tell you, basically consists of taking the variable of interest, binning it over a time tau, and looking at the probability, looking at the wings of the probability distribution by taking the log and dividing by tau. And so that's one thing. I'm really running out of time. I'll close by just telling you very briefly about one other set of experiments, which is to take a collection of these particles in the same. So I'm failing to mention the names of the students involved, but I'll do it at the end. Imagine having a V-shaped wedge and a particle, and these particles running around. What you find is that if the V shape of the wedge is narrow enough, these particles end up getting irreversibly trapped. If not, if the trap is wider, they don't. And these experiments, have now been done in the group in Ajay Sood in considerable detail, and we are beginning to understand what goes on. So Gautam, tell me what I should do as far as time goes. I have 2 minutes left. So shall I just wind up? So what I'll just skip to the end, which is to tell you that you can understand this trapping transition. No, I don't go back. No. This is terrible. You can understand this transition as a competition between influx of particles at a certain rate, escape from the surface, but once the surface is a surface inside the wedge, you can rule out escape of these particles by single particle rotation. All of this would have been easier if I could just show you the movie, sorry. And what you do is to compare the influx rate with the rate of escape due to the formation of a structure that looks like this inside the trap, which you can see if you look here, for example. So if you look at these, what you can see in here is you've actually got a striped structure formed in here. A structure like that from liquid crystal physics has a defect down the center because of the mismatch of the layer spacing. And you can actually build a fairly quantitative theory that shows that the influx and defect-induced expulsion end up giving you a threshold which depends only on the rotational diffusion of the particles. And I need to show you at least one movie somewhere. No, it's not going to work. Okay. So I think what I'll do rather than wait any further is to close here. I've shown you that this active matter approach gives you a unified picture of the fluctuations of self-propelled systems and is a natural language to describe living materials. I told you about entropy production, controlled experiments on artificial self-propelled particles, including a singularity in the large deviation function, and I showed you about how artificial self-propelled particles could get trapped in wedges. The questions that remain of interest are trying to understand the general principles governing things like motility-induced condensation. Is there some kind of thermodynamic potential that's balanced? What about other types of order, dynamics of topological defects, and so forth? And I will leave you with these. And in the negative time available, I'll answer a question if you like.
So in the case where you computed the entropy production rate, and
yes.
You said you get different expressions when you treat them as odd.
Yeah.
Why is that? I didn't
So
understand.
the point is this, that you're talking about two different processes. Imagine a particle moving forward, and then due to noise, without reversing its polarity, moving backwards. That's one comparison you can do. Because in fact, see, if you think of a particle with a position and an orientation, in a fundamental sense, both of those are time reversal even variables. Okay? So you can look at them moving forward. You can ask about the intrinsic dynamics of that system under time reversal. The other is, but the point is, what you actually have is an experimental system in which you can ask about a particle moving like this, or moving like this, or you can ask about the case where a particle moves like this, and compare how often you see this process to the process where between the same initial and final points, you reverse the momentum-like orientation variable and turn it backwards. You can do those two comparisons, and you will naturally get two different results for the forward-backward probability ratio. Now, if the particle equations of motion don't have an additive noise in the equation for the position, then that particle can't back up. The only way it can turn around is by flipping, right? So if you take the limit, if you calculate one of these entropy productions, let's say the one for the particle backing up, if you calculate it in the limit and take that translational noise to 0, you will purely formally get that this entropy production becomes infinite because it will be the power dissipated divided by the effective temperature, the noise strength. Okay. So what you're doing is you're totally ruling out one set of processes. The other thing you can do is you can take the same dynamics as I showed you, switch off the additive noise altogether. Now what happens is you no longer have access to the true steady state, to the steady state of the problem with additive noise. You settle down into a different non-equilibrium steady state. That non-equilibrium steady state has certain entropy production properties, which in the limit where the potential in which the particle is confined is harmonic, turn out to actually give you 0 for the entropy production for that case. However, once you switch on positional noise, even when the confining potential is harmonic, the entropy production is non-zero. And interpolating smoothly between these is actually a tricky issue, which is work in progress. It's almost done.